Hey, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with a deck tech to go over Naya Depths. I wanted to do an updated version for the 2022 primer on green-white depths. And Naya has obviously seen some pretty good success and popularity recently, so I think it's worth going over some of the choices of Naya and why players are moving towards the red splash and away from just the base sort of green-white shell. So first up, this is a kind of mid-range slash combo deck. It depends on how you want to play it. You can play it as a mid-range deck that wins through pretty fair combat with Reclaimers and Knight of the Reliquary, or you can win through Thespian Sage and Dark Depths, creating a 2020 Marit Lage token. So you can play it as a combo deck with a mid-range finish, or a mid-range deck with a combo finish. Kind of similar to Food Chain or even Allurin. These are decks that are really good with a mid-range plan and just have a combo in the deck. They don't really rely on it as much as you might think. And the same thing can be said for green-white depths. There's a lot of games where you don't win through the combo itself, which is really nice. And I think was one of the big reasons why a lot of players moved away from green-black, where typically you are relying on Marit Lage a lot more, and therefore trying to protect it a lot more with cards like Not of This World or Hand Disruption. But this sort of Green Sun Zenith version of depths is really strong. It's very consistent and has multiple avenues of winning, which is really nice. So what you're looking to do is really establish a board state where you can figure out if you have to win quickly through a Dark Depths plan, or if you can kind of grind out your opponent with a more creature-based plan. And that's kind of probably the biggest level up of the deck, is knowing when to go for Dark Depths and when you can just kind of rely on your creatures. The Green Suns package as well does include a nice set of creatures that works really well with the strategy. Sylvan Safekeeper is the first one, which of course gives your creatures protection from cards like Swords of Plowshares, Karakas for Dark Depths, Submerge, Lightning Bolt if it's relevant. It also puts lands in the graveyard at instant speed, which can be relevant for things like Elvish Reclaimer and Knight of the Reliquary. And overall, it's just like a really good way to protect the core sort of strategy of the deck, which is winning through either a 2020 or one of your big creatures. Because it's a Green Suns target, we are just running one, but we essentially have 5 copies, which is really nice. Outland Liberator is a newish card. This is pretty much like Qasali Pridemage, with a huge upside of just being able to become better than just a 1-for-1 trade with your opponent's artifacts or enchantments. If you do get to attack with it, once it's flipped, you can then just start destroying things kind of on command. The big advantage here with the wording is that it's whenever it attacks, it triggers. So a Mazavith or a Glacial Chasm doesn't stop this Frenzied Trap Breaker from destroying something like an Exploration against lands, or maybe a Mox Diamond in kind of a mirror-ish matchup. So Outland Liberator is really nice, and I like it in game 1, especially in this deck, because you want to have an out to something like Ensnaring Bridge, a Blood Moon, a Back to Basics. So having this is really nice. Also getting rid of a Chalice against like an 8-cast deck can be pretty strong, especially if your hand is kind of cluttered up with cards like Crop Rotation or Swords of Plowshares. Ramanap is just a really nice Green Suns target that I think has been in pretty much all Green Suns decks, including Monogreen Post and Maverick, since its printing. It allows you to turn on the graveyard as a resource, which is really strong. It kind of extends your hand that way. And of course, if your 2020 didn't live through its first attack, then you can just rebuy Dark Depths, rebuy Stage. You can get back things like Mazavith or Bojuka Bog, maybe get some extra activations out of it. And of course, Wasteland is really strong with Ramanap, because some decks, especially the greedy ones, can just get locked out by Ramanap getting back Wasteland every turn. So really nice to have Ragavan in the deck. And then lastly, Endurance. I know some people have asked about Endurance and how much it's needed in the main deck. It doesn't really do too much in regards to the actual combo plan. There are some small advantages of putting creatures or lands from your graveyard back into your deck to kind of tutor up them again. But I think Endurance just allows you against decks like Delver to buy a lot of time. And against a deck like Doomsday, it does give you a game 1 out, which is really nice. But it's just a really strong card. It's a 3/4 threat that isn't sort of hit by the graveyard, which is nice. If you're playing against like a Rest in Peace deck or a deck where they're really keeping off anything in the graveyard, then your Knights and Reclaimers are going to be quite small creatures, but Endurance is always a 3/4, which is nice. And yeah, I think against the decks like Delver, where you need to buy a little bit of time sometimes, it's really good at keeping a Delver or DRC at bay, and also keeping a Murktide at bay if you kind of sorcery speed it, which you do a lot of the time against Delver, just to get rid of their graveyard. So Endurance might look a little bit weird, but I think it's just strong enough to be in the deck as a Green Suns target. You then have the 4 Knights and the 4 Reclaimers. This is pretty stock, and I don't really see this changing anytime soon. 4 Crop Rotations as well. Kind of gives you the full 12 ways to instant speed out any sort of land, which is really strong. Knight can sacrifice a plains or a forest for a land. Elvish Reclaimer can sacrifice any land. And one thing to note here is that if you're playing against like a Blood Moon deck, you can turn any land into a basic through Reclaimer, which is really nice. With Knight, you typically can't. One thing to note with Knight is that if Yavimaya is in play, you can sacrifice any land to Knight the Reliquary because they're all forests, which is really nice. So Yavimaya has been a really strong printing for the deck, and I think it's actually sped it up a bit as well, because the deck kind of has the same power level of the Urborg sort of strategy within Green-Black Depths, is that you have the ability to go turn 1 Stage, turn 2 Yavimaya, turn 3 Dark Depths, and now that Dark Depths can tap for mana, you do have the 3 mana, or 2 mana in total, to actually just go off naturally on turn 3, which is really nice. And I think a pretty huge boost for the deck is that you don't need creatures, you don't need spells all the time. I remember just getting this combo online on turn 3 against Standstill, and they had to crack it to fire off a Source of Plowshares, but yeah, just a really nice way to make sure the mana in the deck is also kind of working for you. We do play lands like Dark Depths. This version is playing Maze of Ith, which don't tap the mana naturally. So Yavimaya, sorry, turning on that is really strong. And I'm a huge fan of Yavimaya. I think when we first started playing the deck, Yavimaya was at like a 3 of, but a 2 of is nice because it is a legendary land, so it can be a little bit awkward at times in multiples, but generally speaking, pretty nice. Yav also turning on Flagstones as a forest means that with Knight you're getting kind of 2 lands for 1, which is really sweet. Speaking of the mana base, we'll quickly go over it. So we have 4 Windswept Heath. Windswept Heath, the fetch of choice because it gets both basic, all the jewels, and also Dryad Arbor, which is nice. Sometimes I see like fetch 5 and 6, usually in the green-white versions, but we're making way for a Taiga and a Plateau in this version, because we are wanting to have some red splash in the sideboard. 3 Wastelands. You don't often really need the 4th, especially with Ramanap in the deck. Wasteland, not so much there to aggressively go after your opponent's mana, but really to make sure you have an out to things like Karakas or maybe an opposing Wasteland to start that interaction, and also to keep other Depths decks from being able to create their 2020. Maze of Ith is a really nice choice because it just sort of enhances the tutor ability of Knight. It gives Knight a way to kind of find removal in a way, and Maze is just fantastic against the decks you want it against. Decks like Delver, I do like Maze because it really forces them to find a Wasteland for it, and it can just buy you that extra 1 or 2 turns which you usually need against Delver to be able to assemble the combo and hopefully go off. Bojuka Bog is just a great card against the graveyard decks, especially of Crop Rotation or Reclaimers. Just a really nice one. It also gives the deck access to black mana, which is pretty interesting. You'd have Mox Diamond as well, but there are times where maybe a Jace the Mind Sculptor or Khan the Great Creator in play, and you thankfully have the ability to Prismatic Ending for 4, thanks to Bojuka Bog, which is pretty cool. Karakas. Not much to say. Legacy has some strategies that revolve around legendary creatures, and Karakas is a great way to get rid of them. This deck isn't playing any legendary creatures ourselves, but if you are in a metagame where you want to play Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, or Gaddock Teeg in the sideboard, then Karakas is a nice way to also protect them from any removal. Sajiri Step. 2 steps. A lot of people question the 2 steps, but 2 steps is pretty fantastic. Not many people still recognize that there is going to be a second step in the deck and don't play around it. Usually this is because if you draw a step, you still want one in the deck. And if you use a step early on to keep something like a Reclaimer or Knight online, then you also want to have one as well for the Marit Lage. So 2 steps usually, one for the setup and then one for the kill, which I really like. Flagstones, just the 2 of, and just really nice with Reclaimer. Some of the best starts in this deck, if you're not starting on like a Mox Diamond start, is just turn 1 Forest into Reclaimer, turn 2 Flagstones, hold up Reclaimer, and then end step, get sack the Flagstones, get a Savannah, get another land, and go off from there. One thing to quickly note with Reclaimer is the land does come in tapped. So if you're going for the Thespian Stage Dark Depths plan over 2 turns, make sure you get stage first so that it untaps, and then you don't usually really worry about Dark Depths coming in tapped. So it's just a little thing there. And then the 3-3 split on Dark Depths. This is mainly because we don't really go all in on the Dark Depths plan straight away. I have seen versions with 4 stages, which, you know, it's a very powerful land, and especially with Urza's Saga in the metagame now, it's a great way to get some value off that. Do note that stage is pretty interesting with Urza's Saga. There is a way that you can find in the primer, which I'll put a link into this video description. You can copy a Saga, and then you can actually have stage copy another land like a forest in a way that it keeps the ability to also create construct tokens. So you'll end up with a non-wastelandable land that creates constructs for 2 mana, which is pretty insane. And a really nice way to just get another advantage against some of the mid-range decks. Mox Diamond. So Mox Diamond is probably the most expensive part of the deck if you're not playing Tabernacle in the sideboard. Moxen have been proven to not be necessary to win competitive tournaments. We saw a player top 8 a Eternal Weekend last year, and the most recent SCG Con in Philadelphia was won by Naya Depths, playing no Mox Diamonds either. So definitely don't get sort of pushed away from the deck because of the Moxen. You can play without it, and there's definitely competitive lists that don't play them. I would say it is optimal, but as we can see, there are, you know, other performances with non-Moxen decks that are doing well, which is great. So yeah, I would say if you can, borrow them. If you have them, that's great. But yeah, not fully needed, which is fantastic. All right. Swords to Plowshares, just the best removal spell in the format, probably still. I'm a huge Swords fan. Gets rid of anything that you really care about, even a little pesky Delver, an Uro. It's just a really nice way to make sure that you have some sort of interaction against other creature decks. Sylvan Library, probably my favorite turn 1 player for Mox Diamond. A little bit neutered in power level since the printing of Prismatic Ending, but if you can untap with the library, most of the time these days, because of removal like Prismatic Ending, you're just drawing 8 straight away. You might not against a deck like Delver, where typically you side them out, but yeah, library just a nice way to keep up that sort of card advantage, dig for combo pieces, dig for lands, make your land drops, and also just have, yeah, a bit of card advantage in the deck. Once Upon a Time. So this is actually Jono's list. So Jono Dreadnought 33 took down the Legacy Challenge on the weekend with Naya Depths. And he's playing a 61 card deck. And the big card that he said is the 61st card is Mazavith, which is just a card that he wanted to have in the deck. He couldn't find a cut. And for that, he just played 61, which I'm a fan of. I think in a deck like this, where you have so many tutorable effects, the 61st card doesn't really matter like a normal 60 card deck that might not play as many tutors. So having the extra Mazavith target in the deck, I think the advantages of that outweigh the disadvantages of running 61 cards over 60. And 2 other cards that he played was 2 copies of Once Upon a Time, which is really interesting. He really likes it because I have his words here. I believe it's to make sure your hands consistently online. You want to make sure you have a green source or maybe a Reclaimer. And against some of the fast graveyard combo decks, it allows you to dig for an endurance, which is really nice. It's also not too bad in the mid to late game. It's just for 2 mana to replace itself. Once is just a really nice way to keep adding to that consistency that the deck already has. So in this spot, you might sometimes see like main deck Prismatic Endings, which I'm a fan of. I really like making sure that I have a solid game 1 against Delver, and outs to things like Ensnaring Bridge, which is covered by Outland Liberator, but Prismatic Ending is just so flexible that I'm a huge fan of running sort of removal 5 to 6 in Prismatics. But once it's done really well for Jono, which is awesome. And it kind of shows that there is still some amount of flex in the deck. You can, of course, tune it like any deck to your local metagame, or you can play, some of the silver bullets of Green Suns that you like. Maybe Gaddock Teeg is relevant in your local metagame. Maybe you want to play a Knight of Autumn over Outland Liberator just to have that 2-for-1 value. Definitely a lot of play around it. So let's head to the sideboard, and the kind of main reason we're playing Naya is the blast effects. So Jono's playing 2 Pyroblast and 1 Red Elemental Blast. These are really nice in your blue matchups, of course. 8-cast, Delver, and blue combo are the main ones. It's also really nice against the Bant decks, hitting things like Back to Basics, Jace, Teferi, Uro, if you want to get rid of it on the stack, which is probably the best way to do it. It's the cleanest out to Uro because typically green-white decks have to wait for it to come into play or in the graveyard to remove it, and they've already drawn a card by then, so Pyroblast is just a really clean answer to those cards. Ice Fang as well, Baleful Strix. Also hits things like Thassa's Oracle, which is fantastic as the Doomsday matchup is pretty poor as a green-white main deck. And obviously dealing with a Murktide with a 1-mana spell that isn't swords is really nice as well. It means you can keep those swords for smaller creatures and make sure that your beatdown plan kind of isn't interrupted by your opponent gaining 8 life. The blast effect's just, a nice way for the deck to also play on the stack, which typically for this deck, you can play game 1 as a green-white deck and not show the red splash. So game 2 and 3, your opponent might not actually expect the blast effects out of the board, which is really nice, and a way that I like to play the game if I am playing a light splash like this. Torpor Orb. Torpor Orb's here mainly for Death and Taxes and Doomsday. It does have some nice synergy otherwise, but those are probably the big two, turning off things like Recruit of the Guard, Flicker Wisp, Skyclave Apparition, Stoneforge Mystic, just a lot of answers. Also hitting Solitude and Urion. It's quite hard for them to beat outside of something like Council's Judgment or the new Commando card, which is the 3/1 flash Kusali Primate-esque creature. Torpor Orb really nice, and probably a small reason why Jono's gone with Outland Liberator in this deck over Knight of Autumn, because it doesn't really get turned off, and you are probably wanting Torpor Orb against some of the Outland Liberator decks like Death and Taxes. 2 more Endurance, great against Doomsday, great against Delver. Not too bad, it's just a 3/4 threat against some of the combo decks. And in the mirror, really nice as well. It can make attacking with a Knight or Elvish Reclaimer a little bit risky, because you can, of course, play Endurance, target them, they have no lands in the graveyard, their creatures become really small, you block with a 3/4, quite hard for them to get it back up to like a 4/4 or a Reclaim up to a 3/4 in sort of the combat step. So Endurance really nice there. Chokes just it's a card a little bit like Sylvan Library that has just been hit by Prismatic Ending, but I still really like it, and I think what you need to do now is just be a little bit more patient with Choke and see if you can cast it in the mid to late game rather than the early game, unless they're tapped out. So being able to hit your opponent when they're obviously off a few jewels, and kind of restricting the amount of colors they can get to before they get to answer the Choke is really nice. So just a great card, especially against Delver. Once you bring in the extra removal and make sure you can control the board state, Choke can be really nice at kind of closing out a lot of their ways to start casting 2 spells in 1 turn or making extra value off Expressive Iterations. Don't play a Choke when your opponent has like 3 creatures on board. Instead of removing the creatures. Definitely try to control the board state first and then play a Choke, because there are times where they'll have like an unflipped Delver and a DRC on board, you'll play a Choke, and then they'll flip the Delver, attack for 6, and just have the counter magic for sort of protecting their threats. So it's pretty vital to make sure that you're in a position to cast the Choke and come out of it alive. So definitely just be a little bit patient with the Chokes. Prismatic Ending, versatile removal, can hit anything from a Delver to an Ensnaring Bridge to a Pithing Needle to a Planeswalker. Just a really nice card in this deck, and allows you to deal with a multitude of threats, which is awesome. Force of Vigor, Lands comes to mind. 8 cast, of course, Death and Taxes, some of the Stoneblade decks. Kaldra obviously isn't hit by Force of Vigor, but if you could hit like a Jide or a Batterskull or a Sword, you're going to be pretty happy. It's also just quite nice to have some interaction against decks on the play or on the draw in sort of turn 0. And yeah, just the ability to also sort of 2 for 2 your opponent in a free way is quite nice. So Force is pretty good. This deck also gets to 4 mana pretty quickly, so you don't always have to pitch a card, which is nice. But just makes sure that some of the go wide decks like lands, if they have like an exploration field of the dead start, or D&T with like a Vile Spirit of Labyrinth start, turning off your Sylvan Library, Force can be really strong. One thing to note is Urza's Saga. When it comes into play, the first chapter triggers, so you can actually destroy a Saga before they can tap it for mana, and a lot of the time that's going to be correct. So definitely think about responding to that trigger by destroying the Saga and something else, hopefully, before you let that resolve and let them float the mana off it. Collector Oof in this deck takes a lot of roles. You're not seeing Gaddock Teeg these days because Teeg just doesn't really line up with what we're seeing in the metagame in terms of sweepers or combo. A lot of combo decks are kind of around the 3 CMC range of like Doomsday or Hull Day if you want to call Dazen doing a combo card. Teeg just not really doing what it used to do. So Collector Oof is nice because it holds down some of the combo decks in turning off Lotus Petals and LEDs. It also is quite good against Death and Taxes, which Teeg of course wasn't. And it just has a really nice Hate Bear-esque to it that of course once it's in the deck becomes a 5/of thanks to Green Sun Zenith and allows you to have some of the some game against some of the faster combo decks of the format. Glacial Chasm. So Chasm is in the spot of what I would say is like Blast Zone or Tabernacle here. Chasm solid against decks like Elves that usually try to go for that one big hit. It's also nice against some of the Jund Madness decks that have been running around. I don't mind it against 8 cast either. Just a nice card to allow you to control the board before you set up. But just be wary against some of the decks with Reach. Against Delver, I don't think I'd bring in Chasm just because of the ability for them to just bolt you out. But yeah, a really nice card that allows you to hopefully take your opponent off that big one turn. Like Elves, like if they go for a Crater Hoof and then attack and then in response you bring in Glacial Chasm. It's going to be really hard for them to really kind of come back with the same amount of intent. So do look out for things like Assassin's Trophy or Wasteland, which could be found off a Elvish Reclaimer, but most of the time the Chasm's going to stick if it's come down at instant speed. Tower of the Magistrate, which I just got rid of. This is an interesting one. So target creature gains protection from artifacts until end of turn. So this card is really cool because it allows you to either be aggressive with it and get through artifact creatures like Baleful Strix, like Thopter tokens in the air with your Marit Lage. So against something like 8 cast, it's quite strong. And it also allows you to be defensive. So it's target creature gains protection from artifacts until end of turn. It's not target creature you control, so you can target your opponent's creatures, and you can target your opponent's germs. So if they have a Batterskull or a Kaldra complete, Tower of the Magistrate pretty much removes the germ from the artifact, and then it will just die to state-based actions being a 0/0, which is really strong. It's just a really strong card. There's some little things as well, like maybe saving a creature like Dryad Arbor from liquid metal coating. But Tower just really strong because it can dismantle some of your opponent's ability to kind of pressure you, and then also get you through a lot of your opponent's sort of blockers, especially against 8 cast, which is where it comes up a lot. Another deck that plays Colorless Flyers might be Ninjas playing Ornithopters and Retrofitter Foundry. And also, just if your opponent's going big with constructs, it's nice to have this ability of protection from pretty much colorless until end of turn. So, yeah, Tower, a really cool card. That's really it. That's kind of the breakdown of Naya Depths, why you play the red splash. It is just a light splash as well, which I really like for 2 reasons. One, you are running 1 Taiga, 1 Plateau. So against a deck like Delver, You do have to be wary of Wasteland because you could get in a situation where you just don't have the red mana to cast your blasts in hand, which is never a great feeling. You do have Mox Diamonds to help support that. Flagstones can find Plateau, which is really nice. If you're on a budget, you could play something like Sacred Foundry as well in paper. You could also find room for a second Taiga, but it would be tough. It would probably be something like going up to 29 lands. I don't count Maze of Ith as a land. I guess it's half a land with Yavimaya, so you kind of have 2 lands here in 3 Dark Depths and 1 Maze. You could like cut it once potentially and play a second Taiga, and then maybe even cut the other once and play like a Prismatic Ending main deck and a Prismatic Ending sort of sweet sideboard. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I believe Warra also took down second place in the other Legacy Challenge, which is very cool. So this is a version that was playing main deck Prismatic Endings. It was playing a Boseiju, which is really interesting as well, and I think is worth touching on. Boseiju is a powerful card. In Depths variants like Green-White or Naya, you don't have ways of putting it in your hand. You're not playing anything like Sylvan Scrying or Expedition Map or Life from the Loam. So you do have to find it naturally. So I think it's less powerful in Depths versions, but I do like to see that Warra is playing around with it. Warra is a pretty incredible Depths player. And yeah, to see them trying it out definitely gives the deck a lot of, or gives the card a lot of respect. So I definitely wouldn't sort of blink at anyone who's trying out Boseiju, but it is going to be tough trying to find that one land when you don't really have ways to dig for it other than Sylvan Library. So yeah, cool to see people playing around with it, but I think it'll probably find a home in more of these sort of lands loam decks. Cool to see Paradox Zone showing up here as well. Paradox Zone, just a really nice mid-range card, especially against the Bant decks, because it's a little bit harder for them to deal with outside of Teferi bounce or countering it. It creates a lot of big creatures, which is really cool. It I believe at your end step, you get a fracture token, a fractal token, and it gets +1/+1 encounters on it, where the counters are equal to the number of counters on Paradox Zone, which gets double the number that were on it at the beginning of your end step. So definitely a reader, but yeah, a really cool card to see. The last card I will touch on is probably Seeds of Innocence, which I think with Blastoise seeing a lot of play recently, people have been moving towards. And I do think that Seeds of Innocence is a pretty nice way to tackle 8 cast, but it is a very narrow card. So it's probably taking the place of Force of Vigor in your board, which is tough because against a deck like Enchantress or lands, you're probably wanting the Force of Vigors to hit enchantments. You're probably also wanting the Force against things like potentially Curses or Leyline of the Void decks. So the flexibility of Force for me, I much rather, because it's still a great card against 8 cast, it's just not as much of a silver bullet against 8 cast. So if you're playing like maybe a prelim or a Legacy Challenge, then I would probably toy around with a Seeds of Innocence or 2. But I think, yeah, for now, unless we see a really big meta update with 8 cast taking on a large portion of it, I think for now the Force of Vigors are quite strong, along with the Collector Oof. So yeah, let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or comments below. And if you like this content, definitely consider subscribing and checking out the written primer on the greensunzenith.com. But until then, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.